Alright, now we're going to talk about absolute value. So you can see on your sheet that another word for absolute value is magnitude. We're going to be talking about real numbers, and when we think about the absolute value of a real number, we think of it as the distance between the origin and that number. Key word here is the word distance. That's why an absolute value, another thing we think of whenever we hear absolute value, is that it's always positive. Well, that's because it's referring to a distance. So now let's talk about a few examples. So here we have the temperature in Chicago was a certain value. So if it's a certain value, that means variable. So we could call that X. Last night at midnight. Then it was 87 degrees at noon today. So we want to write an equation to represent the change in temperature over the 12-hour period. So how do I represent change? Well, mathematically, what operation am I going to use? I'm going to use subtraction. Did you like the dramatic pause? I thought it was nice. So again, how do I know it's subtraction? Well, if I want to find the distance between two things, and in this case I'm talking about temperature, so it's kind of hard to think about distance, but we could substitute the word distance for difference, then we understand that it's subtraction, hopefully. So I'm going to do X minus 87 equals the change. Now, I'm not quite done yet because, one, this is a video on absolute value and I haven't used absolute value yet, and two, because I need to figure out, well, is X larger than 87 or is it smaller than 87? Do I care? Well, yes and no. So I don't know if it's larger than 87 or smaller than 87. I could probably make an assumption that the temperature at midnight is probably less than the temperature at noon, but to be safe, to represent the change, we're going to put an absolute value around that difference expression. So I have the absolute value of X minus 87 is the change in temperature. And we want that to be positive because we're representing the change in temperature. We're not trying to say how did the temperature increase or decrease. We're just representing the change. Next one. So here we want to represent or write the distance between X and negative 10 is at least 6. So when we hear the word or see the phrase at least, what is that telling us? So I want you to think about that and try to come up with writing this out. You are not solving anything. We're not trying to solve for X. We're just trying to write this out. I'll give you a hint. It's going to involve absolute value. And also the at least is telling us that it's not going to be an equal sign. So I want you to pause the video and try to write this out. Unpause when you're ready to check your work, or if you get stuck and are not sure. Okay, so there's actually two ways in which we can write this correctly. One of them would be the absolute value of X plus 10 is greater than or equal to 6. So the reason why it's X plus 10, when we just talked about the fact here that when we're talking about distances or differences that we're using subtraction, well, X minus a negative 10 is X plus 10. So that's why we get the absolute value of X plus 10 is greater than or equal to 6. The greater than or equal to is the at least part. The other way to write it is just to switch the order of the values. So negative 10 minus X, absolute value of that is greater than or equal to 6. So either of those would be correct to represent the distance between X and negative 10 is at least 6. Last example. So here I want you to explain, so I'm telling you this can be true. So if we have A as a real number, I want you to explain how it could be true that the absolute value of A equals negative A. So I want you to pause the video and think about that. There are two correct answers. Maybe you can come up with or figure out both, or maybe you get stuck. I'm not sure. So either way, pause the video, think about it, try to answer it, and unpause if you get stuck or when you want to check your answers. Okay, so the two ways that this could happen is, one, if a is equal to 0, then the absolute value of 0 is going to equal negative 0 because negative 0 is still 0, so then the equation would be true. The other way, and this is where we need to understand when we say negative of a number, that's really multiplying the number by negative 1. So if a is already a negative number, then negative of negative a is actually going to be a positive value. So the absolute value of a negative number is always positive, and if we multiply negative 1 times a negative number, it will also be positive. So then the equation would be true. Alright, so what we want to make sure we understand about absolute value is that it's more than just saying always positive, that it's representing a distance from the origin. If we're talking about between two numbers, then it's going to be the absolute value of the difference of those two numbers if that other number is not the origin.